Hi, we're getting into Hot Hand research, the classic paper from 1985 that takes a look at the Philadelphia 76ers with Dr. J and the Boston Celtics with Larry Bird. You can see I'm doing a little work on the home office. I've got some posters that will eventually make their way up to the walls, but I've got my Dr. J poster in the background and all my gear on. We've got Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman. If you take a look at Michael Lewis and Moneyball, he's gone back in the past couple of years, and in one of his newer books, The Undoing Project, he writes that I really should have been writing Moneyball and talking about perceptual bias and the psychological work of Kahneman and Tversky to explain why people are misperceiving what's really valuable in baseball and what they should be paying attention to. The book that Michael Lewis wrote describes a kind of a platonic love story between these two researchers where they had very different ways of working and different personalities, but they came together to form a pretty cohesive team. We've got Amos Tversky on the left, Danny Kahneman on the right. Kahneman is still alive today. He gives a fair amount of interviews. He's a widely renowned psychologist, won the Nobel Prize for behavioral economics. They were working in tandem on ideas about perception and logical fallacies that ended up working its way into the field of economics. So even though they were not economics researchers or professors, their work was adapted much later on. And he was awarded the Nobel Prize for that. Unfortunately, Amos Tversky was not able to win the Nobel Prize. They don't award them posthumously. He did pass away from cancer, but he's still credited with some major contributions to the field of behavioral economics. Tversky was teaching about research in psychology and statistics, and one of his promising grad students, Thomas Gilovich, started thinking we can apply these misperceptions about numbers and some of these psychological fallacies that they were studying, we can apply them to sports. So this idea grows from discussions in class to a project in class, and then they run with it to publish it for the paper. Recently, folks point to Klay Thompson from the Golden State Warriors. He's maybe the best, if not one of the best shooters in the NBA. And he's known for getting into hot streaks that after he makes a bunch, they point to Klay as being unconscious and being in the zone. And some recent researchers have tried to analyze his data in particular to say, well, maybe if we can't find evidence of the hot hand across professional players, we can at least find some evidence of it for Klay, and maybe he's an outlier. When he gets hot, he certainly does seem to get very hot. Gilovich, working with Tversky, they note that it's a generally held belief, or I should say a widely held belief, that the hot hand is real. And it's this area where you have agreement. You have players believing in it. You have coaches believing in it. And you have the fans all believing in it. So they start off saying, we think we've got this overarching belief that transcends all these different audiences. Can we study it? One of the other things they start to point to is if players can get hot and cold, if there is this notion of streak shooting, that we should be able to see it, and they try to mathematically define it, right? So the idea is, if we have a player who's on a hot streak, they are outperforming what their average would suggest. If they're on a cold streak, they would be underperforming what you would expect based on their average. If you had a player like Reynolds, we'll pick on this imaginary player, that is shooting some free throws throughout the game, we would know that for the season she has an 82% success rate, that she usually makes 82% of her free throws. But in this particular game, if you're reading the chart, she goes 2 for 7, which amounts to just under 30%. So this idea that she is underperforming her season average would lead us to think that she was on a cold streak for free throws in this game. What the researchers point out is that in the long run, if this player is making 82%, they are missing 18 And those misses are going to be all sprinkled throughout the season. Just by chance, you're going to have a bunch in a row. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the player's on a cold streak or that something has changed. It's just that they are bound to miss. And sometimes it's going to sequence out in such a way that a bunch of them come together in any one quarter or any one game. That doesn't necessarily mean they're cold. Likewise, if they were making them at a higher rate, right? It's the same thing as if flipping a coin is the example they give. Particularly in sports, we tend to think that a player is going to perform their average in a small set, whether that's in a couple of minutes or in a quarter or a period or in a game or in a couple games. And they call this the law of small numbers. This perceptual bias that if we think that there's going to be a certain proportion in the long run, we expect it in a small sample, even though if you really get into the logic of the statistics, that wouldn't really make a whole lot of sense. At the time that they're writing this paper, they point to Andrew Toney as a star in the NBA that is thought to be a streak shooter, that he can get really hot and pour in a bunch of points. If we're thinking about today, we might think about someone like Klay Thompson or some of the NBA superstars. If you're a Celtics fan from a couple years back, you might be thinking of someone like Terry Rozier, who wasn't necessarily a superstar player, but there was a period when the star player went down and he took over the starting role and he was hitting shots at this really high rate, higher than you would have expected if you'd been watching him for a couple of years. So if we think about Terry Rozier as a streak shooter, that would mean that when they're on a hot streak, they've got to hit more, they've got to have a better success rate than you would normally expect. Right? So they're kind of overperforming their average. And you would expect that their percentage would go up after a make or after a couple of makes. So in this paper, when they're pointing those things out, it's kind of leading them to look for certain pieces of evidence so that they can determine, okay, if we all believe in this, is this thing actually happening? So in this particular paper, they go through 4 studies on their own. Each of the studies is relatively straightforward. They do a nice job explaining, but there's 4 of them, and it can get a little bit confusing. In the first one, they go to the college that they're all at, I believe it was Cornell, and they survey students and they ask them, would you consider yourself to be a basketball fan? If they are a fan, they're eligible for the study. They were looking to see what percentage of them believe in the hot hand, what percentage of them believe that on free throws, making the first one is going to impact the success rate of the second one. So do you believe that they have a better chance of making the second free throw if they've hit the first free throw? Right? So if you would look to the results in the discussion of that first study, you would see the answer there. They also asked them if they believed that hot players would be more likely to take shots. And do you think that if a player seems to be hot, that their teammates should be getting them the ball more often, giving them more opportunities? Often it's called feeding the hot hand. In 1981-82, the Philadelphia 76ers were one of the best teams in the NBA. They pushed the Celtics to a Game 7 in order to try to make it to the NBA championship. They lost to the Celtics, and then the Celtics went on to win. This is a team that has MVP in Dr. J, Julius Erving. They have Moses Malone. They also have a couple of other stars like Andrew Toney and some really high caliber players. Right? So this is one of the elite teams, and it just so happens that they have an in here where they're able to actually talk to some of the players and some of the coaches. So in this one, they got to interview 7 of the players, and they were able to ask them if they believed in the hot hand. And you can look through the results of study 2, and you can see just how many of those 7 believed in the hot hand. You can also see how many of those players thought they'd have a better chance to make their next shot after they had made a few previous shots. So that idea of if you make a couple, does it maybe build confidence? Does it allow you to catch fire a little bit? They asked them, do they in fact try to take more shots? If they've hit a few, do they perceive that, and then do they change their behavior? And then do they think that if a player seems to be getting hot, that they should be passing the ball to them? Or if they feel like they're getting hot, should their teammates be passing the ball to them? Although they didn't get to interview all of the players on the team, they did try to analyze the ones that played the most. So out of the 9 that seemed to play an awful lot, they were able to look at the statistical data, which at the time was not widely publicized or widely available. They used their inside connections to get this. They could look at shooting percentage based on the previous shot. So they looked to see if their shooting percentage got better after they made a shot, or worse if they missed. And then they looked to see over the course of the season, did they find evidence that players were getting hot or cold on given nights? Again, that idea of looking to see what's happening in the short run, but realizing that just by chance they are going to miss a couple in a row, they're going to make a couple in a row, so they're comparing, is it beyond what you would expect by chance? At this point, study 1, they find a bunch of people believe in it, but in study 2, they find, yeah, the players believe in it, but they're not finding statistical evidence of the hot hand. And you might be wondering, why can't they find it? The researchers note there's a couple of things that they're not able to determine. So if there is this confidence factor, is it this idea that a player makes a couple, they gain more confidence, and that allows them to have a better chance of success, or the flip, after missing a couple, do you see that a player loses confidence and continues to miss? They also note that it may be the case that a player gains confidence and then starts taking harder shots. Do they take shots from further away? Do they take shots where they're tightly defended? And just because they're more difficult, their percentage is going to drop down a little bit. So it might be that they're getting a little boost by feeling the hot hand, but they're canceling it out by taking shots that maybe they shouldn't. And then another factor they can't quite figure out is what the other team is doing, right? So if you have a defense playing against a player that's hit a couple of shots, are they adjusting to close out on the player and get closer to them and bug them more? Or are they giving them open shots because they think the player is not very good? So in the NBA Finals last year, there was a little bit of controversy as the Raptors seemed to be giving open shots to Andre Iguodala. Some thought it might be a little bit insulting, but it seemed like the thought process was he's not really making them at a high rate. Go ahead, shoot away. We'll try to have our defenders help elsewhere, and we'll live with the results, right? So what they couldn't tell was if defenders were giving up open shots and then seeing a player hit a few and then get closer, or seeing them miss a few and then sagging off. Right? So they're kind of saying there's all these things that are really difficult for them to control for back in the early 1980s. They have a pretty elegant solution. They go to the Boston Celtics with these handsome mustaches across this team, and they say, well, if we can't figure out all those complex things that are happening in the normal course of the game, what could we try to do to cancel some of those out? So they say, let's just focus on free throws, because here we've got a player that is allowed to take a shot from a set point. Defense can't interfere. Nobody can get close to them. The player can't move any further away. That it controls for a lot of the problems that they weren't able to investigate so far. They go through this team and they're asking, is there any evidence that making or missing the first free throw affects the second? In this team that has some of the best shooters of all time, they're still not able to find it. So they try one more thing. They recruit some of the college players on the men's and women's teams at Cornell, and they run them through some shooting drills. Their idea was, let's find a spot on the floor where a player shoots about 50%, and we'll have them shoot from there. They try to pick one side of the court. They have them shoot there 50 times, and they track the sequence. Are they more likely to hit after a previous make? Are they more likely to miss after a previous miss? Can we find any evidence of hot or cold streaks in here based off of previous performance? If you go to the results section of study 4, you can determine here if the shooting percentage got better after a make, if it got worse after a miss. Was there any evidence of hot or cold streaks happening more than you would expect by chance? And they do add one more wrinkle. If the basketball alone wasn't interesting enough for you, they add a gambling component because they were trying to see if players felt that confidence, if they'd be more willing to bet on themselves. Could they sense when they might be getting hot? So the player had to call out before they shot the next shot if they wanted to gamble a small amount or a larger amount. Right? They actually gave them a little bit of money here. They weren't huge bets, even if they bet the big amount. But the idea was, if they're betting bigger, that's a proxy for feeling more confident. If they are betting bigger and feeling more confident, are they more likely to hit the shot? They also recruited a teammate, and the idea was maybe that your teammate is aware of when you're on a hot streak or warming up or cooling off. And likewise, the teammate would have to bet before the shot if that player was going to make or miss the next one. So what they found was that both the players and the teammates, they were willing to bet more money after the shooter hit a shot. So the shooter themselves, if they were betting more, it didn't seem to affect the percentage their shot was going in. Same thing if they were betting less. The teammate, they couldn't really figure out when their shooter buddy was getting hot or not. So again, we have kind of another knock against the hot hand. The conclusion across all four of these different little studies in this one paper was that the hot hand is not real. It's probably an artifact of memory bias, that it's kind of out of the norm for a player to make a few in a row, miss a few in a row, especially if we're thinking about the most exciting moments and maybe some of our favorite players. So we think back and we can access those memories really quickly. They come to mind. So it would seem as if we really do believe in the hot hand when we're really just kind of cherry picking a couple of key moments and not factoring in what's happening in the long run because we can't remember all those other times where it wasn't happening. They note it might also just be a misperception, that we are taking some kind of mental shortcut or heuristic to fill in the blanks and tell ourselves a nice little story about confidence and feeling hot and trying to explain maybe behaviors that we've observed, maybe we've done. And ultimately, they determined the hot hand is a fallacy. So the paper is published in 1985. Paper's legacy was sustained for about 30 years. Statistically minded folks, a lot of eggheads would kind of point out this idea that the hot hand is not real, that if you believe in it, you're making a mistake, which rubs a lot of people the wrong way, especially if you have a whole lot of fans and players and coaches believing in it in this small analytics community that is arguing that it is not real, so causing a lot of tension there. It seemed like for 30 years the game was over for the hot hand, but in around 2014 and on, a couple of other researchers dove back into that 1985 paper, and they also made use of video tracking technology to try to address some of the problems that they couldn't solve in 1985. So if you want to know if players are feeling hot and taking more difficult shots, if their teammates are in fact passing the ball to them at a higher rate, if you want to see if defenders are reacting differently, now with video cameras all over the NBA courts and 360-degree tracking data, you can map all those things out and analyze them and do a more complicated analysis than Gilovich and Tversky could back in 1985. So stay tuned for the next one when we jump to 2014 and we see what they've been able to add with technology to determine if it is fact or fiction.